Zags, Bruins, Sweet 16, Mick Cronin, Mark Few. Huge game once again. We're crossing it up. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags and Locked On UCLA podcast. It is a crossover episode previewing a huge game between Gonzaga and UCLA. I'm Andy Patton, the host of Locked On Zags podcast. He's Zachary Anderson Yoxheimer, the host of the Locked On UCLA podcast. We're talking all things Gonzaga Bulldogs, UCLA Bruins today. Today's episode is brought to you by by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Like I said, we're talking all things Gonzaga UCLA today. We're going to close out the show talking about the history of this matchup and kind of the Adam Morrison of it all, the Jalen Suggs of it all, of course, and kind of what it might mean for these teams going forward. But first, I'm going to talk to Zach about this matchup, what it kind of means for UCLA. We'll kind of flip the script. Words are hard. We'll try that again in the second segment. But for right now, Zach, I kind of just want to talk about how UCLA got here, because you kind of look at the regular season and they dominated the Pac-12, which Pac-12 wasn't great this year. There's no other way to put it there. But I think they won by 4 games in the regular season.
Yeah.
4 games in the regular season. That for a power conference, that's just ludicrous. I thought they deserved to get a 1 seed. The Jaylen Clark injury, I think, had an impact, unfortunately, on the committee's minds and maybe kind of pushed them down to that 2 seed. Of course, Purdue got the 1 seed. Didn't go great for them in that situation. I want to talk to you about starting with the Clark injury, because this is a guy who was the Pac-12 Defensive Player of the Year, who was a finalist for the Naismith Defensive Player of the Year, averaged 13 and 6 for the Bruins, like a really big piece. And yet, doesn't seem like they have really slowed down all that much since losing him to an injury.
I think the biggest thing is team-wide, the defensive intensity has been just picked up. And because Clark is, individually so great, right? It's tough to make up what he loses, but offensively it's been picked up, which we'll probably touch on. But Amari Bailey has stepped it up offensively. And then defensively, Jaquez can do it all. Bona can help with the blocks. Everybody has got that built-in hustle bone, deflection bone intensity. And if you're new to that, Mick Cronin has a deflection bone as a reward to incentivize the Bruins' defensive intensity. So even if Jaylen Clark's not there, the difference between defense is a lot individually, but it's going to show a little bit more the deeper we get in the tournament. And this might be the first game it shows.
We saw the injury as well to David Singleton, which looked very bad on the broadcast. Brendan Haywood, the announcer, was basically pleading with the crew to not show a replay of it. But all indications as of right now, as we're recording this here on Wednesday morning, are that he seems okay. Is that what you've been seeing or kind of hearing about his status for the game? And also, how important is he for a matchup against Gonzaga?
First, I've seen after the game, I think UCLA's beat reporter, Ben Bolch, he tweeted out, looks like he's walking around just fine. I saw other tweets yesterday from across Twitter that he was walking on the bus just fine. Like he was literally walking from the locker room to the bus. So he's going to play. Whether he's kind of hiding it behind a tough premise, he's going to play. How effective he is, who knows? In terms of what he needs to do, well, this is going to be a high-scoring game or a higher-scoring game that we probably think, especially for UCLA. You're going to have to hit some threes, and Singleton's going to need to hit 3 or 4, not go 1 for 5. He needs to have a 3 or 4 3-point shooting game in order to help the Bruins keep up with the Zags offensively.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that matchup specifically, starting with kind of the defensive side for UCLA, because it starts with Drew Timme. Gonzaga's offense has been filtered through Drew Timme to a borderline unhealthy degree at sometimes this season. I think we've seen Gonzaga in the last month or so start to figure out ways to work inside out with their offense and utilize players like Julian Strother and Rasir Bolton and Malachi Smith a little bit more. But by and large, Gonzaga's offense runs through Drew Timme. And if he's off, the team is off. Now, Drew Timme has played against Mick Cronin UCLA squads a handful of times already. He has put up productive numbers against them, as he has done against most of the teams that he has faced. Looking at this roster, obviously, Adem Bona seemingly no longer bothered by the shoulder, I think, is the huge factor for UCLA because he seems to be their enforcer down low. But how do you think that UCLA might attack Drew here? Is this a situation of trying to shut everybody else down? Are they going to swarm him with double teams, try to prevent him from getting the basketball? Like, we've seen a lot of different strategies and not a lot that have worked, although there are definitely ways to beat Gonzaga, whether it involves Drew Timme or not.
I mean, the biggest thing is UCLA got to play Arizona. And while Gonzaga isn't necessarily Arizona had two bigs. They had Ballo, they had Tubelis. They had a three-point shooter. It seems like the Zags had a little more depth in terms of perimeter shooting. But there's not really anybody like Timme. Tubelis has a different skill set. Ballo has a different skill set. And some seem to have the comparison of Jaquez versus Timme, just the size is the only difference. So I think the biggest difference is the Bruins have already dealt with size and lost to size. And Cronin's seen Timme. I think the difference in this one from 2 years ago in the Final Four is I think they have a little bit more size, at least with Bona's athleticism, and they'll just attack him with Nuba, Bona, Etienne, and I think they'll just throw the kitchen sink at him and try to find themselves multiple guys. The big thing is, can they stay out of foul trouble? Can Bona stay out of foul trouble? The longer he's on the floor, I think it might be a little tougher for Timme. Not that he won't be successful, but the fact that they can slow him down and stop him from crashing the boards will be important.
Definitely. And I think with Timme, he's really good at exploiting younger players to get foul trouble. And I think that's going to be because Bona's going to be one of the best young bigs that he has faced all season long. And so it'll be interesting to see if he's able to kind of work that magic and get some of that foul issues, because that's going to put Cronin and the team in a bit of a tough position. I want to switch over and talk a little bit on the other side of the ball here. Gonzaga, not a good defensive team. That has been the biggest knock on them throughout the season. I think their overall KenPom ranking defensively is a tiny bit misleading in the sense that they have been a much better defensive team over the past 6 weeks or so than they were earlier in the season. Having said that, they don't have a Chet Holmgren. They don't have a rim protector to help clean up some of the mistakes they make in the pick and roll game. Drew Timme is notoriously not great on pick and roll defense. He has improved significantly in that area, but you look at UCLA, look at their offense. To me, it seems like an offense that relies heavily on getting to the rim, dribble penetration. Amari Bailey, very good at that. Like you mentioned, Jaime Jaquez, of course, just a very multifaceted scorer in a lot of ways. It seems like a game that kind of matches up well with UCLA in terms of how they like to score. Is that kind of the sense that you're getting looking at Gonzaga's defense and how this might shake out?
I mean, if you look at the numbers between Gonzaga and Arizona, they seem somewhat similar defensively, right? They score a lot of points, they give up a lot of points. But when UCLA played Arizona, the game they won, it was high scoring. The games they lost were low scoring, like UCLA likes it, both in the Pac-12 tournament and way back, I believe, in January. So if Gonzaga can stop UCLA from getting out in transition, I know the Zags are one of the better teams in the country in transition. If defensively they stop UCLA from, one, forcing turnovers and scoring 22 fast break points like they did against Northwestern, then maybe they could clog the paint. If Bona's struggling, if Jaquez struggles with the size of Timme potentially, that could be one thing. But I think it comes down to UCLA spacing the floor with Singleton and Campbell, which opens up the lane for Bailey or for Bona or Jaquez to make those moves. And it just depends on how many turnovers lead to easy points for UCLA, because they need a lot of easy points. If they don't get easy points, this certainly won't be an easy offensive game for them, even with the Zags' lackluster defense.
Well, it is Zachary's turn to ask questions. We're going to pivot to the second segment, have him talk to me a little bit more about the Zags after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. The NCAA tournament is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. So just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It is safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers and threes drained. Right now, the FanDuel line on this game is 2.5 for UCLA. Perhaps Zach or I will talk you into betting on that line there. But you can also combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. If you want to just take over from here, man, you can.
All right. Well, welcome back to this crossover between Locked On UCLA and Locked On Zags. I guess it's my turn to start asking Andy some questions so he can spread the wealth of knowledge. Do you think UCLA's defense is good enough to stop the Zags offense in your mind? Is it that potent, or is it kind of misleading with the numbers considering the teams the Zags have faced in the WCC and taken over during the NCAA tournament?
Yeah, I think, you look at Gonzaga's non-conference schedule, and they had some really, really dominant offensive performances against teams that I would compare to UCLA. I mean, they scored 100 points on Alabama, a team that certainly picked up the slack defensively after that. Like they did not play particularly great defensively in that game in particular. Gonzaga did struggle to score against Baylor. They struggled to score against Michigan State, although I think you kind of throw that whole game out since it was played on an aircraft carrier. I don't think the offensive performances in those games just really matter. But we've seen Gonzaga play really well offensively against teams that weren't just teams in the WCC, but UCLA does have more athleticism. They have more weapons, and I think that they're extremely well coached on the defensive end of the floor. That's Mick Cronin's specialty. There's a reason this team has been to the Sweet 16 3 years in a row. They do a good job down there. I think Drew Timme is basically inevitable in the sense that he's going to get 18 to 20 to maybe 26, 28 per game, just almost regardless of how you defend him. That's just how good that he is. But if you can force him to make 4 or 5 turnovers, making bad passes, Gonzaga's out perimeter shooting is questionable at best. At times, it can be a huge weapon for them when Bolton is hitting, when Strother's hitting, when Malachi Smith is hitting. And at that point, the defense, it's really difficult because you have to pay attention to the shooters, but then you're giving Drew Timme more room to operate. And when he has room to operate, he's pretty much a walking bucket. So I think UCLA absolutely has the capability of defending Gonzaga better than most of the teams that they have played, but it also depends on which version of Gonzaga's offense, specifically players not named Drew Timme, show up.
And then speaking of Gonzaga's defense, as we flip sides of the court, Anton Watson, if I'm saying that correct, he's Anton, not exactly Anton Watson. Between Jaylen Clark and him, they're in the top 30 in steals, and Jaylen Clark's been well up there for a while. I kind of noticed Watson's numbers and realized, hey, this is almost a mini Clark in terms of defensive efficiency. I know Timme gets the blocks down on the paint a bit, but Watson, 66 steals. Well, what do you think about his potential individual defensive stand that can make a difference in this game?
Mark Few has called Anton Watson the MVP of this team on multiple occasions and has said that the other players on the team kind of agree with that. And I think, MVP is it's hard to say that when you're talking about Drew Timme and the National Player of the Year candidate, but Anton Watson is certainly more rounded in terms of being able to contribute offensively and defensively. Drew, not a great defensive player. The pick and roll defense is suspect, and he is kind of the de facto rim protector on the team, but it's not a huge strength of his either. Watson has some of the most active hands in the country. He is elite at poking the ball away, elite at getting steals. His perimeter defense he's been an elite perimeter defender since he was a freshman, and he's finally kind of started to emerge as more of an offensive threat this year. But prior to this, he was kind of just a defensive enforcer, and that was the role that he filled for 3 seasons. Local kid from Spokane High School, Gonzaga Prep, like kind of a beloved figure for the Zags. And I think he's going to have a huge impact in this game. He's 6'8", he's a 230, 235, something like that. He's a big-bodied guy, really physical, really, really strong. And I think he's going to make a really big impact on this game defensively. I suspect that he will be in charge of guarding Jaime Jaquez. Not an easy task by any stretch of the imagination, but Watson was tasked with guarding Oscar Tshiebwe, and he handled that pretty well in the non-conference schedule. So I think we've seen him kind of take on high-level defensive tasks previously, and he has the defensive chops to do it. If it slows him down offensively, that is okay. Quite honestly, if you told me that Anton Watson scored 4 points in this game, but he held Jaquez to one of his worst shooting games of the tournament or of the season, I'm going to take that in the heartbeat, because that's more of what I need, what the Zags need from him in this game. And I think he's more than capable of being a huge defensive nuisance for the Bruins.
Yeah, because as much as we talk about the Zags' lackluster defense, they do have what we could say is a mini Jaylen Clark, almost a pretty good Jaylen Clark. It's just Clark got all the recognition being in the power conference. Yeah. We already mentioned Naismith Defensive Player of the Year finalist, all that. But, it could be interesting. What's one key statistic you think Gonzaga needs to win this game?
That's a really good question. I think they need to win on the boards. I think that's a big part too. Certainly UCLA is a good rebounding team, but they don't have a ton of size. Of course, Jaylen Clark was their second leading rebounder before he got hurt. Jaquez is a great rebounder. I think he's 6'7", so he's not huge. He's a tenacious rebounder, very good at going after the basketball. But I think rebounding is definitely going to be a factor here. And it'll be interesting to see how Gonzaga approaches offensive rebounds. Do they attempt to get to clean up on the offensive glass and get second chance points at the risk of allowing UCLA to potentially get out in transition? We have seen Gonzaga kind of alter their strategies here sometimes. I remember specifically they played Xavier earlier this year in the Phil Knight Invitational Tournament, and they were really, really aggressive at trying to go get offensive rebounds instead of kind of playing back and being a bit more tentative and just getting back in transition. And like a team like Texas, who they played earlier in the year, just got out in transition constantly and worked them. And I mean, that was one of the biggest blowouts that Gonzaga has suffered in a really long time. And part of that was Texas going nuclear from beyond the arc and hitting 13 threes. But we've seen Gonzaga sometimes be really aggressive at crashing the offensive glass and sometimes be a bit more tentative in trying to just prevent teams from getting out in transition. So I'm curious how they will attack UCLA here, whether they will attempt to kind of push for some more offensive rebounds, because I think UCLA is a team that you can beat on the boards. And I think for Gonzaga, getting more second chance points, not letting UCLA get a lot of second chance points, cleaning up the defensive glass, even if they don't get out in transition as much as they'd like to, if they're really intentional about winning on the boards, I think that's a statistic that I think will have a pretty significant outcome on this game.
Yeah, UCLA was minus 11 in offensive rebounds against Northwestern. I'm not even sure if the Wildcats actually took clear advantage of their second chance opportunities, but they clearly got back in that game in the second round and gave the Bruins a run for their money. But the UCLA also had 22 fast break points, as I've already mentioned. So that could be the key, because I believe we're both on the same page. This game, unless UCLA forces a lot of turnovers, will pretty much be won or lost on the boards and the rebounding, barring someone going nuclear, as you said, shooting the basketball on either side. It'll be won on the principles of rebounding the basketball, the fundamentals. As much as we talk about high scoring defense, got to rebound the basketball. And UCLA can lose that stat, but if it's not minus 15, then they can very well be in this game. Well, in the meantime, I know there's a lot of history in this matchup, right, Andy? We talk about the 2006, we talk about 2021, even the oft-forgotten, I believe, 2015 matchup, which I don't even know if it was even fair. But even then, there's been a lot of matchups. What do you love most, reminiscing and hate reminiscing about all those matchups? I know the Zags are technically 2-1 in the last, say, 17 years against the Bruins.
Yeah, I think it's fun that we're seeing this West Coast rivalry kind of develop, and it's a tournament rivalry. They have played each other in the non-conference before, but not in a while that I remember. I know they played. They had a
in Vegas like last year.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, they did do that. But I would love to see them do more consistent home and homes. I think that would be extremely fun. I'd be curious if that's something that they can put together or not, especially, of course, with UCLA eventually joining the Big Ten. I'm curious how much that will impact their non-conference scheduling. But for me, West Coast basketball doesn't get a lot of positive press. They haven't won an NCAA tournament since 1997, so there is some level of a reason for that. But UCLA and Gonzaga and Arizona to an extent, those are the three programs that really stand out, and for good reason. UCLA and Arizona just dominated the Pac-12. Nobody else in that conference was particularly good this year. Obviously, the WCC has Gonzaga and St. Mary's, and that is kind of it. The Mountain West has had an issue producing in the NCAA tournament. Shout out San Diego State for actually doing it this year. But Gonzaga and UCLA are the pinnacle of West Coast college basketball. And anytime they match up, you can kind of highlight that. You can show, and they play very different styles right now, which I think is very fun. UCLA has obviously had a long-standing reputation for being one of the truest blue bloods in the tournament in the nation, and now we're seeing them be kind of this more defensive team. And Mick Cronin's bringing like kind of a Midwest East Coast style of basketball out to the West Coast, and I think that's fun. But I think seeing these teams develop and grow and change. I mean, Gonzaga has obviously gone through monumental changes in the last 20 years, from being a plucky underdog to a national powerhouse that is disliked by everybody, is a pretty wild stretch of reputation changing to happen in a 2-decade period. And I think it's fun that these two teams kind of can still have this rivalry. We can still harken back to 2006 when it was a 3 seed versus a 2 seed, but the teams were in such different states. Like, they were not the state that they are in now. And I think that's kind of what makes this full circle feel fun, of like, yeah, it's 17 years to the day. It's a 2 seed versus a 3 seed, chance to go to the Elite Eight. Like, it's a lot of the same stuff on paper, but the vibes around the program are very different. And to me, that kind of makes it fun that you have the same schools, the same programs, same matchups, but so much changing kind of just over time.
For me, I'm pretty young. So the 2006 one was definitely one of the early memories of UCLA basketball for me. One of those where I was young enough that I had to get sent to bed before the game ended. And my mother woke me up. It's like, wait a minute. And I saw them come back, watch the missed shot at the buzzer. I was like, wait, what? That was one of my very early memories, being a UCLA basketball fan. And of course, I mentioned this in my pod the other day, but a few years ago at the Sweet 16 Elite Eight in the regional, when Gonzaga was there at the Honda Center, I actually ran into Adam Morrison, but I didn't actually make fun of him. So I thought that was kind of funny. I was like, oh yeah, how you doing? He was broadcasting. So I thought that was pretty funny. I didn't do a Jordan Farmar. I gave him a crying picture of him when he was with the Lakers. That was not in the cards. So, it's an interesting matchup. And as much as Gonzaga is 2-1, this does feel somewhat of a rubber match, right? Where this is UCLA Gonzaga in 06 was like to get to the Final Four, or get in the path to the Final Four, I should say. In the Final Four a couple of years ago, Gonzaga had the unbeaten season, get everything going their way until the final. And funny enough, both teams who won these games have lost in the final, ironically enough, in 06 and in 21. Although the winner of this one only gets an even tougher West Regional final matchup in the Elite Eight. So it doesn't get any easier. That's just a Sweet 16 game between two teams with 30 wins. I did my math. Over the last 10 NCAA tournaments that were non-COVID affected, this is only the 6th or 7th time, I think the 7th time, where both teams have had 30 wins in the Elite Eight.
Wow. That is crazy. And this region is just, Kansas obviously being out is insane, but UConn is a top 15 team in KenPom. St. Mary's is a top 15 team in KenPom before they got eliminated. Like, Gonzaga and UCLA, one of these two teams is going to advance. A very, very good team is not going to advance. And then whoever does advance is going to play either UConn or Arkansas. And certainly Arkansas as an 8 seed, I think may look on paper like, oh, that's the preferred matchup, or that's, the worst team that's remaining. And I think statistically that's probably true, but it's kind of diminishing to Arkansas, who's a very, very good team, was a preseason top 10 team. And to me, this West region, whoever comes out of this game is going to play a really, really tough game. I'm curious, looking ahead, obviously the focus for UCLA and for Gonzaga is this upcoming game. But if you had a preference on who you would want to face or how you think this region might shake out outside of this game.
It's just a very tough one. I think we talked about this on the Locked On College Basketball hit we had to do the other day. Arkansas is just so tough. And then UConn, despite that weird midseason lull, they are highly rated in the analytic department. If you don't like analytics, you can just see they're a good team. They play scrappy and all that. So we'll see how that plays out. I think it's time for some predictions, right? Well, what do we think is actually going to happen, Andy? What are your thoughts?
I think Gonzaga is going to need to shoot the 3-ball well and space the floor a little bit in order to give Drew Timme some room to operate. They have been very inconsistent at that this season. There's just sometimes Julian Strawther is on and he hits 5 or 6 threes in the game. Nolan Hickman hit 5 threes in the WCC championship game against St. Mary's, but he has a lot of disappearing acts as well. He also got hit in the head pretty hard in their last game. So we're hoping that he is at 100% coming into this game as Gonzaga's starting point guard. But give me the Zags by 3. Give me the Zags by 5 or so. I think it's going to be a close game. I think Gonzaga's offense is enough to get to 70 points. And I think 75 points maybe is what you need in this game, because UCLA is going to score a lot of points going downhill towards the basket. But I think the Zags are playing some really good basketball right now. I will be honest, I've been worried about UCLA's injuries throughout the tournament, and it has not impacted them yet. So maybe it's foolish to continue to think that it will, that they won't be able to play as well without Jaylen Clark. But if Singleton's healthy, if Bailey's healthy, and if they're just missing Clark, this team has played really, really well without him. I think this is going to be a really close game, but like I said, give me the Zags by 3 or so.
I'll go opposite, of course. You might say it's a homer pick. Who knows? I'm thinking 73-71. That might kind of ring a bell, something similar. I'm thinking UCLA. They've been able to win games of the higher scoring variety as of late for a long time, into even like the month of March or late February. They hadn't won a game when they'd given up 70 points. Now they've done it a couple of times in the Pac-12 tournament. I think they did it against Arizona in the regular season finale. They found ways to win while giving up 70 points. It's close. It's much tougher. They don't like that, but I think they've learned how to do it. And this is going to key on Singleton needing to hit some huge threes. He has to hit 3, 4, 5 threes, open up the lane, and force them to key on him. And then I think Tiger Campbell can't go 0 from the field. He can go hit his 12 free throws, but he needs to hit some jump shots. And if it's a clutch jump shot for the win or something, they just need to open the paint. And even though Gonzaga is not the best defensive team, they do have some size. They can crash the boards. And UCLA needs to make that space for them to score in the paint. And if they can do that, force some turnovers. And even though they didn't force a lot against Northwestern, they made them pay in terms of points off turnovers. They did that to UNC Asheville. That has to be the same against Gonzaga. They've got to steal possessions away from the Zags. And if they can do all those things while not just getting absolutely murdered on the boards, I think UCLA can eke this one out in the Sweet 16 in Vegas. Although Vegas hasn't been fond on the Bruins in recent times. They lost to the Zags last year. They lost twice in November. Who knows what this Vegas regional will mean for UCLA.
I think that's a perfect place to end it. FanDuel likes UCLA, for the record, 2.5 as the points there. So for Zachary's pick there, I think right on the lines there if anybody is interested in betting on the game. I'm Andy Patton. Make sure I'm pointing the right way. He is Zachary Anderson Yoxheimer, host of Locked On UCLA. This has been a crossover episode. Very, very excited for the game on Thursday. Check out Locked On Zags and Locked On Bruins wherever you get your podcasts. Find them on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a review on iTunes. Follow us on Twitter, all of that good stuff. We got plenty more content coming your way as we get closer to the Sweet 16. One of us going on to the Elite Eight, one of us starting the offseason content a little bit earlier than we hoped. Thank you all for listening. I'll say go Zags. You offer
Bruins.
what you want. There it is.
Go
Bruins.